Part two. Let me get back to this. Lower Paleolithic period, towards the end of it, humans leave Africa. They begin spreading out. As they do, they are bringing with them new skills and a new mentality. This idea that maybe there's something out there. And we begin to see the development of the earliest religions. The first human religion is the animist religion. Animist, A-N-I-M-I-S-T. The animist religion, which still exists today, it is a religion, is the traditional religion of Africa, it's traditional religion of Native Americans. You'll see that in Europe, the Druids, and a lot of other people who are animist. Animists believe essentially this. They believe that there are two parts to existence. There's a spiritual world, and there is the material world. Many people who don't know much about animism think that animists are polytheistic. They believe in many gods. It's not true. Most animist religions are monotheistic. They believe in one god. There are exceptions. For instance, the Viking religion with Thor and all them, Marvel Comics. Theirs is an animist religion, but it's polytheistic. But most are monotheistic. They believe in one great life force, and that great life force is in the spiritual existence. All living things belong part of that life force. They believe that everything important that happens in the material world first happens in the spiritual world. So if you want to contact the spiritual world, animists will say you need to focus on the spiritual world. Animists believe that everyone has the power to touch, to come in contact with the spiritual world. But most people in an animist religion only have very limited abilities. So you can contact your dead relatives, for instance. You can still speak to them, and you can still hear from them and hear their advice. Most people don't have that's about it. But there are special people in an animist religion who have special powers, larger powers. They have the ability to wander into the spiritual world and affect things that happen in our material world. Animists believe in good and evil, but unlike some Western religions, they don't believe that good created evil as a way to challenge humanity. They believe that they are two separate things. Good is there and evil is there. And they believe that most of the time, 60% of the time, evil wins. And it's nobody's fault. It just happens that way. Animists believe that that this one God can be contacted, but you have to focus. Either you got to find one of these people who have free access, and you got to be very careful with these people because some of these people are evil, and so they do evil things in the spiritual world, and some of them are good. So you got to be careful. We can call them witches, we can call them whatever you want to, all right? But these people have this ability. If you want to contact the spiritual world, you either get one of these people you can trust, not easy to do, or you can try yourself. And the way you try yourself is you find a way to focus on a part of the great God. So you want it to rain, okay? You focus on the part of the God that reigns. So you might create a little statue or some kind of an icon, something that will help you focus, say, I need rain. I was brought up Catholic, and in Catholic we have lots of icons. There are crosses and crucifixes and all kinds of things you grab onto when you're in trouble. Well, in an animist religion, you want to rain, you have something that looks like something you're hoping that part of God will respond to. Many Westerners, when they first came to Africa, for instance, thought that animists were polytheistic, believed in many gods because they saw them praying to these different icons and symbols and statues. And really, they didn't take the time to really learn what the religion was about and find out that they're focused on an aspect of this religion. Now, this religion, early religions, beginning in the lower Paleolithic, beginning of the Mesolithic period, coming out of Africa. As humans begin to come out of Africa, they are still hunters and gatherers, but they begin to migrate towards places where they can find animals. And of course, that means rivers. If you're talking about the Middle East, you're talking about the Tigris Euphrates. If you're talking about Egypt, you're talking about the Nile. If you're talking about Europe, you're talking about the Danube. In China, we have what's known as the Yellow River. Humans, as they begin to come out of Africa, they begin to migrate and they begin to gather towards these major river areas. What race are they? We're going to get back to that question. I always found that kind of humorous that people even brought this up, as though somehow different races were created in Africa and then a bell was blown and everyone went off to their different continents and the Africans stayed. We came out of Africa as defined by today as black people, and we developed these skin and facial differences and body differences as we adapted to different environments, so the theory says. As we began to migrate towards these major rivers, we began to settle down, and we entered into what is known as the Neolithic period. Now, the Neolithic period doesn't have a specific time frame because it's not based on time. It's based on achievement. Neolithic is when a people make the transition from being hunters and gatherers to farmers. From hunters and gatherers to farmers. How did they do that? Why did they do that? Well, let me give you two theories quickly, you guys, about how we made the transition from hunters and gatherers to farmers. The one that's called the traditional theory. The traditional theory says this, certainly one I was brought up on, and certainly has a lot of credibility to this day. So that theory says this. It said, humans began to migrate towards the major rivers of the world because there they could find animals, natural irrigation, there was a lot of plant life, they could find food. When they got there and they found these places like the Nile River and the Tigris Euphrates, they found an abundance of food, and this abundance of food made them settle down. And they settled down in one place. And as they settled down in one place, they began to develop. They had extra time because there was a plentiful food. And this extra time enabled them to develop their brains. And they made a monumental mental progress. They jumped from being simple hunters and gatherers to being farmers. And this was considered in the traditional theories to be a huge evolution in our development. As they began to farm, still in the traditional theory, they settled down, they farmed, and as they began to farm, they began to run into some social problems. Because no matter where you are in the world, if you have simple farmers all in a small community, there are going to be some people who are very good farmers, and there are going to be some people who are terrible farmers. Now remember, they're animists, so it's not like you're being punished by God. In animism, you're not being punished by God. Evil things happen to good people, and it's nobody's fault. It just happens. But you've got a community now where some people are able to feed their children, and some people are not. Now, those people who are not able to feed their children, so the theory goes, have got to do something about this. They're not going to sit there and just starve to death. So they're going to sharpen some sticks and go over to this other people and say, give us your food. So now we've got a problem of social conflict. How do you solve that problem? Well, the theory is that a political innovation took place. Humans began to create leadership roles in which a person would have the power, a single person, would have the power to take surplus from one group and give it to a starving group and create some kind of social peace. Well, of course, in doing so, what you've done is you've given somebody the power of life and death. I can give some people food and other people I don't like no food and they die. So where does the power of life and death come from? No, there's only one source, and that is from the great spiritual God. So every early leader, known as a priest king, is related to God in some way, or the gods in some way, to give him that kind of authority. Where does that authority come from? From the gods. Where does the authority for our president come from? From our Constitution and the public and democracy. That's where the authority comes from. If you remember in Middle Ages, we'll get to Middle Ages in this class eventually, and they'll say, by what right do kings and queens rule? Well, they were chosen by God. All right. Well, in these early societies, the leaders are in fact directly connected to God. And not just chosen, but they are essentially a God or part of God. That's where they get this authority. Okay, fine. So you got yourself organized. You got yourself a little political organization. The economy's running well. You're able to share enough so you don't have social strife. But there's another community down the river. And this community is nothing but farmers who can't grow anything. And they're starving to death. They look up at the first community and go, they got everything here. Okay? Now, maybe we're not bright enough to farm, and maybe we can't get ourselves organized, but we can sharpen sticks and we can go up and attack these people and prevent ourselves and our children from starving. So now the first community got themselves a problem. How do we protect our food? Well, easy. You create another institution called the military. So in order to protect, in order to create a society of some stability based on food, you've created three institutions. You've created a religious institution, you've created a political institution, and you've created a military institution. And the irony of this, of course, is these people who run these institutions don't actually produce anything, but they're given all the power. All the farmers have essentially given all the power to those who don't produce anything and say, you take care of society. Well, there's going to be, of course, some corruption. Now, of course, once you create these farming communities, you have a problem, because farming takes a lot of labor. Right? So your population is going to increase as farming communities want more and more kids. Of course, they love their children, but kids on a farming community are essentially labor. They're free labor. Of course, when these kids grow up, they're going to want their own farm. So now you begin to expand. You expand from the riverbanks into the hilltops, and you expand from land that's easily farmed, where you don't really need much in the way of tools, to land that now, as the population grows and each person gets older and wants a farm, they begin to expand into land that's not so easy to farm. Then you have to develop tools, and you begin to see early plows during the Neolithic period. You begin to see early tools for harnessing cattle and horses, so that you can help now farm on land that's tougher and doesn't grow as easily as it does on the riverbank water. Now, the non-traditional theory, which is actually becoming, let's call it an alternative theory, it's becoming the more popular theory nowadays, is based on environment. It starts off pretty much the same way, the new theory. It says, yes, humans developed, and as they began to come out of Africa, they focused on going towards major rivers where there's food and easily accessible plant life. But the new theory says, rather than making this huge evolutionary jump, what really happened was humans gathered in such large numbers that they began to eat up all the accessible food. And just like humans have today, in the past and today, rather than saying we better conserve some of this for the future, or we better not eat so many animals, they just gobbled it all up. Well, as they began to use up all the resources and food became tougher and tougher to find, they had to come up with another option. When you've got tens of thousands of people living on an area there, they can't just suddenly leave and decide we're going to look elsewhere. And they got to find something else. And that something else was farming. So the second theory says that the transition from hunting and gathering to farming, it wasn't a grand evolutionary jump. In fact, it was something that humans had no choice. We had to become farmers. Of course, after that, then everything remains the same basic stuff. They create the institutions, they begin to expand over farmland, populations increase because farming gives you a stable source of food, which means you can have more kids. And of course, those kids become labor as well, and then they grow up and want more and more farmland, and we begin to spread around the world. So Neolithic means essentially the transition from hunting and gathering to farming. All right? We'll talk about early civilizations in the next one. Thanks, guys.